Hey TCSTV viewers, it's Evelyn coming to you live from the camera store. Tonight we're very excited to present another photography book launch. Tonight we're looking at a stunning backdrop, Alberta in the Movies, from 1917 to 1960. And before we get started, on behalf of the camera store, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of Siksika, Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and Stoney Nakoda. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Today we have the fortunate opportunity to gather, recreate, and work within this city and province, and we offer our gratitude and appreciation for the land and the people before us. Tonight we're talking about a new book title that is wildly rooted in history, with Mary Graham's book that is beautifully written and illustrated with archival photography and features century-old sets alongside photographs of the locations that they appear by photographers today. We have work from a variety of photographers, and one of them is actually in the house with us tonight as well. And so we're going to be able to have the opportunity to talk to George Weber, who fondly is very engaged in the camera store community. So I'll be introducing him shortly, as well as the author, Mary Graham. But before we introduce them, I just want to thank our TCS TV live dream team. Tonight we have Jeff and Gary working behind the scenes to make sure that everything goes smoothly, and they always do a wonderful job. And so we hope everything goes off without a hitch. But what I love most about these live streams is being able to interact with all of you. So we hope that you will engage. Feel free to share your comments, ask questions, and you can do so in the chat. And if for some reason you're not logged into YouTube and you still want to share some thoughts, I will also take questions by email. So my email address is evelyn@thecamerastore.com, and I'll do my best to check both of those sources so you can share all of your thoughts and questions as we go. So if you're not familiar with our guest already, Mary Graham is a writer, a documentary journalist, and a film historian. She has appeared as a feature film specialist at CBC Radio and Art, the European Cultural Channel. She presents frequently on her ongoing work on the importance of Indigenous contributions to Alberta film history in the media and at universities, museums, and other public venues. I'm also going to mention George Weber, and he is, like I said, a key fixture on our bookshelves behind me. We're in the book nook of the camera store, and in his career since the 1970s, he's become globally admired as a documentary photographer with 10 books. I think that number might actually be creeping up, and countless exhibitions. And I'm absolutely honored to also welcome both of these wonderful people here at the camera store tonight so they can join all of you at home. Thanks so much, George and Mary, for joining us.
Thanks, Evelyn.
Yeah, so of course, tonight we're going to talk about your new book. So this is a stunning backdrop, and it's about Alberta in the Movies from 1970 to 1960. So obviously there's a lot of history here. But before we get into some of the details of the book, Mary, why don't you share a little bit about the genesis of this? How did this come to be for you?
This book is based on the Kauai film, on the concept of the Kauai film book, which is probably in its 13th printing. I think it was first published in the 1990s, and it's not as involved as this book. It doesn't include as much photography, but it basically takes you around the province of Kauai and shows you where the filming locations for movies such as Jurassic Park are. And my husband is half Hawaiian, and we've spent a lot of time there, and we've had cranky kids. And he doesn't like going to the beaches. He'll only go to local beaches, and that a lot of those don't welcome his whole family because they're for Hawaiians only. So a lot of the time when we're in Hawaii, we drive around and look at filming locations. And I came back in 2008, and I thought that there would be a book in Alberta, and there wasn't. So I pitched the story to the Calgary Film Commissioner, and he loved it, and then sent me off to our provincial capital to meet with the provincial film commissioner, and we agreed that I would do a book of movie landscapes in Alberta. And there's only, at that time, there was only 2 or 3 film jurisdictions with books. And New Mexico, I think Mexico just got one recently. And they were very keen to have something that they could take down and slap on people in Hollywood's desks, because there was some concern about screen fatigue and not being able to really absorb and appreciate. So it started as a coffee table book 12 years ago, and it got half done. We got to 1960, so so.
Phenomenal. And then, of course, we have George Weber here with us. Can you tell us, George, how you became part of this project and working with Mary?
Well, Mary and I were introduced by a mutual acquaintance, a publisher named Don Gorman. And of course, I'm a movie fan, as you know, and I've traveled the province extensively. So the idea of sort of marrying a couple of great loves for me, you know, the geography of the province, and a keen interest in the history of cinema. But I will also share with you that a lot of the work that Mary uncovered as part of her project was stuff that was really kind of new to me as well. So I found that a really exciting opportunity to, work with her to sort of uncover things that hadn't been well known before her book was published.
Absolutely. Now, Mary, why do you think Hollywood and cinematographers from around the globe were so drawn to Alberta in particular? When you started with the early 1900s, really,
Yeah.
What did you discover?
There was chatter about Alberta Light back in the 1800s. They were sending journalists up here, and they came. Frank Berzaghi, who won the first Academy Award, shot 3 movies in Alberta, and he came for the realism, for the spectacular, unspoiled, absolutely brutally, and you'll see it in the book, some of the landscapes. I was kind of expecting very beautiful landscape shots, and everything was very pastoral, but they're brutal, and the scenery is brutal. And they came for that. They came for the light. The light at Morley is particularly known to cinematographers. It's not too north, it's not too south. There's something about Morley we go from 1917 to The Revenant, Prey, which just came out. Many movies have been shot at Morley. James Wong Howe, who is probably, I think, one of the best cinematographers of all time, shot a movie in 1924. And it was at Castle Mountain, which is, I don't know if you've been there, but it's in the book too. It's a spectacular place. It is all shadows and light, and James Wong Howe was particularly interested in shadows. The other thing is, for cinematographers, and I really grew to love what they do and respect what they do, and it's an art form, and wow. The light and the shadows in Alberta are always changing. So Alberta never looks the same. Like you can go, and it changes all year round. Like in the winter, the landscape is completely different than what it is in the summer. And I think it's just absolutely intriguing to them. So, and it has been for 100 years. I mean,
yeah. Now, from a photographer perspective, George, what do you think it is about the mountains and rolling into the prairies that is so attractive that you want to capture that and be able to showcase it in film or in photography?
Well, there's a couple of things just to pick up on what Mary was saying. One of them, of course, is the quality of light that is sometimes associated with what we refer to as the magic hour. It's that late part of the day. Some people say it's the hour on either side. The hour before sunset, the hour preceding sunrise. But there's a particular quality to the light in Alberta just after sunset, and my all-time favorite movie, I think, which is the most beautiful thing ever shot in Alberta, maybe Canada, is a movie called Days of Heaven. And a lot of that movie was shot after sunset, and there's something about the enveloping, omnidirectional, sweet, warm quality of the light that has been extraordinarily attractive to cinematographers. There's also kind of an interesting little thing that, as Mary referenced, I mean, of course, this was like fresh material. This was virgin material to these Hollywood filmmakers. But the people of Southern California were just enraptured by snow. Now, sometimes we don't see it that way when we live here. But there was something about the snowy landscape that had almost kind of a mythic, beautiful, sort of pristine quality to it. And the fact that it hadn't been shot much, all of those things contributed to making this place exceptionally attractive. And, getting here and shooting on this location was not without some considerable effort. So it really had to kind of reward their effort to make the trip to come here, Evelyn.
Well, I'm gonna flip over to my screen here quickly. So I'll show you what I'm looking at here.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe you can share a little bit of detail on this photograph, and also just, I mean, look at the weather conditions in this. Anyone that's lived in Alberta through the winter knows that this is not fun to spend time in.
That is Reginald Barker, I believe, in the overcoat. Reginald Barker shot Civilization in 1916. He's I mean, all of those young guys, and they were young, who came up in the late 1900s or 1910s and 1920s. They were film pioneers. They're the monster masters. So this is Snowblind. I think, is that Snowblind? He
Yeah, I
shot
think
two?
the cover for that is right here.
Okay. And he came up here, they got obsessed with snow movies around this is shot in 1921, so around the time they came up here in pursuit of snow. And he actually, the lights that you saw there were a variation on the Kliegel lights, the union always corrects me. And he had them specially made so he could shoot snow. Snowblind is about two brothers, one bad, one good, who live in the wilderness, and a young girl who I actually saw the movie at the Library of Congress. She retreats to the wilderness after she's ogled on a vaudeville stage, and she shows up on their doorstep, and she's become snowblind by the brilliant, magnificent, blinding snow, and she falls in love with the bad brother. And it turns out when she regains her sight that she discovers who he is, and she and her his little brother have to escape down the bow, and they actually have Mounties chasing them in motorized boats, and they go up over the Victoria Glacier at Lake Louise to escape, and there's lots of shots of that. So what you're seeing there is them filming with the particular lights they had brought up to get snow scenes. They actually, I think they came in November, and they were saying they didn't get the snow they wanted. Barker said next time he'd come in February. They went back to somewhere in British Columbia to try to get snow scenes, and that wasn't successful. And they went back to California, and that wasn't successful. So
Okay.
I guess what you're seeing is one snow scene they did get. So.
Yeah, and then what about it was the Unseeing Eyes in 1921? So I think that's just a little further ahead here.
Unseen. Oh, yeah, this one. Yeah, Lionel Barrymore. Yeah.
Yeah, and then same thing with them in their big coats in the plane.
Yeah, they both of the cinematographers were military pilots who shot in World War I, and that was a special plane they brought in. I can't remember the exact name, but it was a big deal. They actually had some sort of clipboard so that when they flew, they filmed going over the Rockies, and when they were saying their lines, it was a silent movie, but they had their knees holding clipboards for their lines, and they would just mime them in the plane. So they shot in eastern British Columbia over the Rockies, and then they came over and shot in Banff Lake Louise for a couple weeks.
So when someone's new to this book, what would you say that they can expect when they're looking at it, and what are they going to see in this book? Is it primarily stories, photographs? There's new photographs sharing some of these places. I'll let you share.
It's an ultra-visual journey through 60 years of absolutely remarkable filmmaking with a number of perspectives and a number of stories. I worked with the Stoney Nakoda to capture their history because it hadn't. They've been involved since at least 1917. I was particularly interested in capturing Albertan stories, and there's two archives in Banff and Jasper that both have records of first-hand stories. I wrote the book for the people of Banff. I wrote the book for the Stoney Nakoda and other bands, and I wrote the book for Hollywood because it became very apparent as I was getting into it that this history is extremely important to Hollywood. So it's
excellent. Now, of course, George, your involvement a lot of the time with this book is creating the contemporary photographs. Mm-hmm. So what were some of the challenges when looking back at the stories, how to recreate some of these scenes and be able to capture these places?
Well, I guess the biggest one was just the, most landscape photography and most documentary photography has to do with spending, an extended period of time watching for those special moments where everything kind of comes together. When Mary and I were doing the shoots, we would schedule a day. We'd kind of look at the weather forecast. We would hope that the weather would be good when we got there. But I think it did give me an insight into what cinematographers work with, because they're on a location. They have to problem solve and get the best photograph within the limitations of the timelines and the restrictions of what's going on in the film, essentially. So where I would like to, and I think many of the other guys, when they're doing traditional landscape work, hang out over the course of days, sometimes weeks, to capture the photograph. Our challenge was to try and capture the best possible image we could get in the moment that had been allotted, sort of thing, right? I looked at a lot of the films, or a lot of, I've been an avid film watcher for many years. I sort of adapted my own way of shooting. As you know, Evelyn, my typical approach is to work with lenses of normal focal length. And because that produces something which is sort of true, for want of a better word, right? Cinematographers, and when I was working with Mary, I was often working with longer focal length lenses to sort of lift, pack, compress, and sort of stack. So instead of trying to sort of tell the truth, I was working the same way the cinematographers were. We were trying to work the landscape. We were trying to mine it. We were trying to upgrade it, enhance it, to tell the story.
To tell the story of the truth that existed to create the films.
That's right, and of course it is about working and sort of mythologizing, and that's where especially these master cinematographers. And it's interesting, as Mary can share with you in greater detail, there's actually been 4 Academy Award winning cinematography Oscars awarded to a film shot in Alberta, which is an extraordinary thing. I don't know if there's any other little place in the world that's got 4 Oscars in a particularly small, geographic location.
Yeah, Alberta's film history is really remarkable. When I went to the Oscars archives to research, they had files on every movie shot in Alberta because of the connections to the Academy Awards, either the directors or somebody in the crew had won an Academy Award. So it's a remarkable history, and I know 4 is a more modern number, and I'm just researching that now. So I hope it's higher, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Now, Mary, since this was such a vast history that we're talking about, films that were created 80, maybe 100 years ago now that we're in 2023, how did you come about to research these locations, and what was your method of madness, and how long did it take you to do this?
For the one that James Longhouse shot, the Alaskan, in 1924, we had friends on a ranch in eastern BC, and their family, it was shot at their ranch, and I came up to Banff probably 4 or 5 times a summer to try to find that location. And Parks Canada, everybody would say, well, go talk to so-and-so at Parks Canada, they know everything. And they'd say, no, there were no films shot near Castle Mountain, everything is Lake Minnewaca. And so a lot of times I had a little scrap piece of paper set still from an archive, and I would drive around looking for it. And then finally I met with a longtime Banff resident whose mother actually worked on the movie. And she just looked at me and she told me exactly where to go. But that was 4 or 5 years of, trying to find it. A lot of finding the exact locations took a lot of very specific research over a number of years. And, the Stampede movies, there were 3 or 4 shot. Every ranch in southern Alberta claimed that these movies were shot there. And so that was a quagmire of 2 years getting that figured out. And then it was just nailing down, and that was going through detailed newspaper reports 6 months before the movie was shot and 6 months after. So just to try to find specific locations. I had a lot of help from the Library of Congress. They came in really early. I didn't know what I had, and they did. And they were like, okay, you just, you know, you keep going and come back. And I was like, whoa.
Did you find it was encouraging from them? Like, was everybody supportive?
Unbelievable. They right from the get-go. I probably met up with them 2 years in, and for the James Wong Howe movie, I woke up one morning and they had sent me the digital key to their digital vault, and I understand that they wanted more information on James Wong Howe and the other anime Wong, the many prominent. Tommy Meehan, Tommy was everybody's favorite in 1924. I understand they wanted more information, so it was mutually very beneficial. But they were the Library of Congress, they're the best in the world, and they just it was a trip. And thank you very much. So,
we have a question here in the chat. One of the things that I love about Alberta is how you can drive an hour out of Calgary in 4 different directions and get a completely different type of environment. Can you name a film, perhaps from the book, that you thought did a good job of that? Or did you find that they were a little bit more linear in the approach of where they went?
The 1926 film, which George did the photography for, it's actually a spectacular story how he came to that photograph, but that was shot on a road somewhere between Nanton and High River, and if you know the area, you know all those back roads, the range roads, the dirt roads, they crisscross, and the landscape is spectacular. It's constantly changing. You've got the Porcupine Hills, I think, and you've got the Rocky Mountains. But trying to find where exactly that movie was shot, parts of it were shot at Haysboro, it was called Turner Siding, but it is actually Haysboro in Calgary. It was in the country. Calgary wasn't there at that time. So when they came up here, they were going to shoot in the Rocky Mountains. The big thing in Hollywood is that their landscapes were depleted. It was said over and over and over again, and the story is very desolate. It got booed off the stage when it was a play in Edmonton. It was Flo Ziegfeld and his wife, and they had to leave town very fast. Canadians went ballistic. I think it was 1916, and then the studio kept trying to revise it. And they brought in William One-Shot Bodine, who's, there's a lot of you who agree with me, but he's probably, he's a huge, huge cult director. He actually saw the movie in the 70s, the date. But so trying to find, George and I, we knew that they shot at ranches. I have notes from Bodine of where he shot, but George and I went out one day, and we'd been at Superman's house where was that?
Not far from High River.
Not far from High River,
yeah.
Past the green Quonset, down the dirt road and around the back. And we'd had a really successful morning, and so we thought, well, let's go check out High River and try to find this place in Nanton, because I had been out 2 or 3 times, and probably more than that. And George had rigged up this system to go to the bathroom. I would open the door and go on the passenger side. And he would open the door and go on the driver's side. So I was busy, and we had been driving up and down those roads and trying to get a perspective of where it actually would have been. And he disappeared, and actually Paul Zitzka was up in Jasper being taken into Devona Siding by Parks Canada and the CPR, and that was an operation. So I was on the phone with Paul, and GW just disappeared, and then he had found another dirt road, and he was walking down it very fast, and so I got in the car and caught up with him, and he stopped and he took the picture, and we didn't have a set still for that one, and when I finally found a set still, I think it was in the Oscars archives, it was an exact match. So
wow. Let's take a peek at, I'm just going to go back to my screen here, at one of George's contemporary photographs.
Okay, that one. Yeah.
So George, can you tell us a little bit about what you were creating here with this image?
Well, it was really interesting, and you don't get a sense of it, but Mary had somehow talked her way into the Wainwright military training facility. So there were weapons, unexploded stuff, and we were just kind of driving around through there, sort of a thing.
Can I skip some?
Please.
They gave me permission to go in really fast, so George and I drove up to Wainwright, which is about a 5-hour drive. I'll be really quick.
No, take your time.
And so we thought, well, we'll go in just before the light, just at dusk. We'll try to get in there, and we expected this massive discussion at the gate about going in, and I don't know how they knew what my car was, but they just waved us through. And the next day I said, GW, I'm going to get out and talk to them. And they're like, nope, just go. So that was spooky.
It was amazing. And so in that particular case, we were like on the training, the facility for the military in Wainwright, near Wainwright. And we were shooting different locations. And the thing about this photograph, it is like it was an attempt to produce something very kind of austere, it's not a dramatic photograph. It kind of breaks all the rules of photography. Right? It's half land, it's half sky, half land. There's no strong center of interest. But Mary ended up finding a still that again was one of these little fortuitous things. We may have stumbled onto almost an exact location for something we shot in, I think it was 1922 or 23, Mary. And another little tweak that we did, or I did with some of the editing, was to kind of give sort of a warm tone black and white image, something that sort of evoked perhaps the era in which the photograph was made. But I was always thinking when I was photographing, I was trying to imagine literally following her title, right? A spectacular backdrop, essentially, right? And so I was imagining, how a director, a cinematographer could fold or introduce a foreground element into the background that we had tried to capture with the photography that we were working on.
That was a bison stampede. 10,000 bison came up. That Thomas Ince, the father of the Western, came up to do it. And actually, Tim Burton has the footage in his movie about the director, the wackadoodle director, Ed Wood.
Oh yeah.
And I remember with GW, like if you look in the book, the set still has a couple of buff bison carcasses. And GW's picture, we didn't have the set still at the time, and they were an exact match. I remember saying, George, we need a tree in that picture, and it was like, it's a stampede.
Yeah.
There were no trees.
There were no trees. And then that,
okay, I'm gonna skip ahead to a couple more of your contemporary photographs here. Mm-hmm. Okay, so tell us about this one.
Go ahead.
Well, it was just, again, it was that idea of the layering. So you'll recognize probably, Evelyn, this was shot with about a 200 millimeter lens. So there was that lifting and compressing. I really was riffing on that one, especially on a lot of the cinematography done in Legends of the Fall. John Toll won the Academy Award for cinematography for that film. And you'll see a lot of beautiful stuff shot on First Nations land west of Calgary. And you see the mountains up high and being drawn in close. It was standing in from Montana around 1880. And it was done with that classic approach of using the longer focal length lens to lift and compress and sort of pull planes together to create an effective background. Now this one has a bit of a foreground element in it as well. I think those are some sort of branding facility or something like that, Mary.
That was the King's Ranch.
Yes.
Yes.
And tell Evelyn which king we're talking about.
Duke
here.
of Windsor. And so he was breeding, somebody will know, a special kind of cattle. But I actually had a wrangler look at that photo who worked in many movies, and he said it looks like it did 100 years ago. Yeah. It's just, it evokes, I always call it refuge for a king. And because that's when he bought the ranch, I think it was somewhere in well, the movie was shot in 1925, so it was probably after 1920.
Yeah.
But it was his refuge, and those gates were I think they were, for breeding cattle, but I'm not a rancher. I don't know if you are, but...
Right. He's familiar. All right, we'll go up here to one more. There we go. This one here from Longview, inside one of the Stampede Ranch House.
Yeah.
So that was an interior, and I think Mary might be able to give you a bit more detail, but I believe that location, there's an image in the book, Mary, of the crew sort of meeting in that space. Is that correct? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, this was Guy Wiedeck's ranch, and it was...
And just for people who don't know Guy Wiedeck.
He founded the Calgary Stampede, and He was a very, one thing I did find out in my research, he was a very strong friend to all of the Indigenous bands in Alberta, and a proponent, and helped them greatly at times when they were being oppressed and other things, worse things. So he had, he bought Stampede Ranch, I think around 1912, and there'll be people who will correct me if I'm wrong, and many movies in Alberta were shot there. And we got these shots a week before the ranch was sold, and then it was torn down.
Yeah, tragically. So that some of this work actually not only serves Mary's wonderful book, but it serves the role of important documentation. I think if you were to step one photograph forward, Evelyn, or backwards, I guess, I'm sorry. So
Yeah,
they're
thanks.
seeing sort of the context of the ranch, and that interior that we saw was what building would that have been, Mary, within the ranch?
Well, somebody told me that he had a pool table, so I think that was actually his living room. I think it was
Okay.
in his quarters. And the ranch was bought by a family who had a home for kids, who needed a home. And the windows, what they loved is that when they sat there, if a kid decided to leave the ranch in a huff, they could see all the way around out every window, and the kids couldn't get very far because you've got mountains there and then huge prairie. So.
Yeah.
No, it was really, George and George documented everything. I think we were there 2 days,
believe so,
photographing
yeah,
everything. And we got it all digitalized. And those are actually from Guy Wiedeck's scrapbooks, so personal books.
Wonderful. Now, you touched on Indigenous people before, and how it was very important for you in this book to be respectful and to honor them in the documentation of what happened within this time period. Can you talk a little bit about how you did that practically, and how it's been received by the Indigenous people?
One thing to do the book, I had to get all the movies, and when I got the movies, the Nakota, although the Samson Cree, the Siksika, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, they've all been involved in movies. But the Nakota were in movies, in many, many movies, but they weren't documented or credited. And I was seeing things, the 1938 movie by Milton Rosemary is a British director. There was an episode where one of the Nakota speaks his name in his language, and it was a very odd thing to be in a movie, and I thought there's something going on there. So I approached the Nakota, and I met with them in downtown offices for about 6 months, talking and being educated, and then they introduced me to 10 to 12 elders, and we worked for a year and a half watching movies and capturing the history. Also their perspective. Somebody from the Film Union came into every session, and there was a lot of really good discussions. I was very reluctant to talk about the book until the Nakota saw it, and they're very, very, very happy with it, because I intertwine what was happening to them through the 60 years in terms of how their culture was being eradicated, the horrible things that were being done to them, and also it was absolutely devastating, when we got to the mid-50s, to see the sexualization of their women furthered. I found a movie in 1926 where there was an Indian princess, a scantily clad Indian princess. I hadn't realized the sexualization of their women had started that early. And it was devastating to watch their culture change in front of them. Their great chiefs were in the movies. One of the things when Borzage and those young filmmakers, Borzage I think was only 23 when he came here, they were looking for realism. Cowboys and Indian movies the concept hadn't been set yet, even though Thomas Ince came a number of times. The American history wasn't as established, so they wanted Indigenous people in their natural element, in a natural setting as they were. They weren't looking for quote-unquote movie Indians. So there are movies that I was given one movie from the Library of Congress to take to the Nakota to show them, because it is their people in their own teepee, their own setting, and they're shown helping the Mounties for when a man escapes into the wild. Mm-hmm. But we went over the century, the racism of the 50s, the gonzo racism, just the changes are heartbreaking. So it's been really, really well received. They threw a party for me on Friday, which George was at. It was just rocking. They ran the show, didn't they?
And it was a great evening, Mary. Yeah,
it was
for sure.
fantastic. And the elders from the film project came. The Nakota know how to represent, I would say that. And they were so happy and mingling, and it was good.
Wonderful. Now, in doing this project, how has your perspective changed on the film history from when you went into it and to how you feel about it now?
Well, I've lost my religion. I must say that. Who invented pornography? I mean, see what was done to them. I've completely changed as a person. In terms of film history, everybody thought it was B-Westerns, and it hadn't been compiled before. And a lot of it was self-taught because this history wasn't available. And as I got into it, I started realizing the magnitude of it. And it really wasn't until I was talking to, I knew there was something up at the Oscars archives when they had so much material. But I was talking to a film guy, and we were looking at the list of movies in the back, and we were like, holy macaroni, this is incredible. So it's changed completely. And I'm kind of reluctant to say it because I don't want to sit here and say Alberta's the best, but it's probably got one of the most significant film histories in the world. And I would say the Stoney Nakoda, maybe, I don't have the research on other bands or tribes, but I would say they're probably, certainly in Canada, but globally, they're probably one of the Aboriginal people, Aboriginal, Indigenous, I don't like Aboriginal, but one of the only, if not the only Aboriginal people that have a record of themselves on film for 100 years, tracing the changes to their culture. It's heartbreaking.
We have a good question here in the chat from Terry. If there's any possibility of doing a documentary based on the content of the book. I guess this gets into our next questions of what's next for you, Mary.
Oh, there's a documentary underway, and it's being done by Cody Left Hand. And Cody, I mentioned your name this time. He was like, mention my name, Mary. And I will mention your name because you're fabulous. Cody Left Hand, Gary Burns, Dalton, I don't know your last name. They were quite rowdy at the party on Friday night. There's a crew of them. No, they're doing a bigger project. I believe they're doing 4 movies, and this film history is being incorporated into one of them. So that's underway.
Oh, phenomenal. Now, speaking of names, I was wondering if you can talk about the 5 photographers that you chose to work with on this contemporary project. We know George Weber was one of them, but can you talk about who else was involved in the contemporary photography side of this?
I have to say those photographers were phenomenal, and they put up with nonsense I don't think people of George's caliber are used to putting up with, or Paul Zitska. I needed regional photographers because number one, you needed to be able to go out and access the spot in a short period of time. Jeff Wallace, I think you're still in St. Albert. Jeff did Northern Alberta. He did Lesser Slave Lake, and he did the John Ford shot The Searchers at Elk Island Park, and for when John Wayne shoots the bison, and Jeff did Elk Island Park. And Jeff, that was that winter, 2018, when everything was iced in. It was cold, cold, cold. He went back to Elk Island about 6 times. He went to Lesser Slave Lake a number of times. So thank you, Jeff. Got phenomenal photos. He met with an original resident, Garth Lodge, who pointed out where the cabin was that Nell Shipman had stayed in. And so the mountain photography was done by Paul Zitska, and Paul he was one of the earliest photographers in, because so many of the movies were shot in the mountains. He had
I'll put one on the screen. You can see while we're talking.
He had paper, like George. He had papers, set stills, and I would just give him this crumpled up set still, and off he'd go, and he would produce. Paul was particularly interested, it's funny, George did the landscapes of the ranches in the south, and George's are more landscapes. Paul was very interested in the particular location in the mountains. So for the John Barrymore, Ernest Lubitsch movie, I wasn't able to get the photo, but there's a picture of John Barrymore popping out of a very famous, very high altitude Canadian Rocky landmark. And Paul went up and replicated that. They filmed a lot on the Victoria Glacier. They were crazy. Those guys. They had Stony Nakota mountain guides. They had the Swiss guides from the CPR. Paul went up and did the Victoria Glacier. He did the Jasper shots. So he was. They were all very generous. Very, you know. And then Solomon Shinnequay is a very young Nakota photographer who works in black and white. He did the Morley shots. He did Fort McLeod. He did Bankview. He replicated the crazy mining town of Bankview. He did a modern shot as well. And if you look at his photo, that is probably the scene that we had the most difficult. It changed the most over time. The original photo is this sort of barren bottom of a bowl with a town, and the vegetation had changed. So Solomon did it. He replicated that, and he works in black and white, which really made the producer, Brian Scribner, very happy because he likes black and white.
Yes.
And
so we have the Castle Mountain photograph from
Solomon did the Castle Mountain, and it was perfect because James Wong Howe is shadows and light, and Solomon is shadows and light. So it was, and the photograph he did has a few little pieces of wood in the foreground, which, you know, that's all that's left of, you know, there was no environmental damage. Mm-hmm. And then Jean Beck is my neighbor, and he went out with me in 2016, and just, we were trying to find the filming locations and take the shots so we could see what they would look like and set it up for the detailed photography. I didn't have any money at the time, so I had to pay John out of my pocket. But some of the photos he took actually ended up in the book from that time too. So he kind of did the town of Banff area. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this would be the town of Banff in this photograph here from Jane Beck. And now back to you, George. Mary mentioned that it was a challenge. There's lots of challenges that you wouldn't maybe normally have to deal with. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about what some of those were for you personally, and how did you overcome it?
Well, again, it's, you know, a lot of documentary and landscape work is done with, you know, really with the luxury of time, essentially, right? And as I mentioned earlier, you know, we're often, when we have a lot of time, we can go at different seasons, different times of the day, and that sort of different lighting conditions and that sort of thing. Most of this was kind of gridded out, and it was shot very much like a film would be made, essentially, right? You would attempt to do the best, get the best image you could within the limitations that you were dealing with. But I really took it on as not so much a challenge as a bit of an inspiration, because I looked at these great films, and this one that I referenced that I love so much, Days of Heaven. It was a revolutionary film when it was shot, because it was mainly shot in this sort of magic hour after sunset. So they had camera placements gridded out. They would shoot a scene and then sprint to the next place, because it was such a narrow little sliver of time. The film was not even supposed to have been shot in Alberta. It was supposed to have been shot in Texas, but because of the changing seasons, it kept getting bumped further and further north. It was directed by Terrence Malick, you know, who's one of the most revered of this generation's filmmakers. So I was really kind of inspired by the problem solving, the skill of these master cinematographers. And of course, Mary and I, it was just a crew of two, right? It wasn't that complicated, except for the washroom arrangements, right? But when you're dealing with a large crew, it's that capacity to make something really good. And that film, and also was an example of, it took an incredibly long time to actually edit and put together, because of the disparate, sometimes contradictory lighting, and it went through, there were several cinematographers that worked on it. So the challenges were, it was kind of like it was like a challenge, you know, to try and replicate, riff off of the work of these great master cinematographers. So it was a lot of fun, essentially.
Yeah.
Wonderful. We have a question here from Elaine. Do you know how many Oscars were won for films filmed in Alberta? And I'll add to that, within this period. Do you know? Or can you think of any specific ones?
Well, 1941, 49th Parallel won an Oscar. I'm just trying to think. There were a lot of Oscar-winning directors. A lot of top 10 directors through the 1920s. They were on those lists every year. White Wilderness, the Disney movie shot on Tunnel Mountain from 1953, I think, to 1958. It won an Oscar. I think a lot of these films are these directors and cinematographers very early in their careers, and I can tell you that the directors and cinematographers won Oscars, but not always for these films. But it's absolutely amazing to see these films because it's like, okay, I can see it.
George, you were well known for your documentary photography of Alberta and the Canadian prairies, the West. How is this a different kind of photography for you, and how did you approach it from a technical and aesthetic perspective?
Well, yeah, like I guess, the biggest difference is, with my documentary work, I'm really trying to be as simple, as accurate, as truthful as possible, essentially, right? That's kind of, and I have done extensive photography in First Nations communities, Hutterite colonies, and that sort of thing. So my work tends to be sort of austere, simple, straightforward. With this project, it was really much more about where I normally sort of respect the raw material. Here I was trying to craft, work with, embellish, enhance the raw material. Simple things like the choice of a normal lens for my traditional work, the telephoto lens for a lot of the work that was done in this book. There were some things in terms of editing. As you look at my contributions in the book, you'll see color work, you'll see black and white, you'll see tone, sepia toned work. So it was trying to, kind of unpack the toolkit, which is much more of what I do when I'm doing commercial work. So this project for all of us, I think, was really, it was a fascinating project, but it was more kind of assignment work, just in the way that a cinematographer, when he's creating a film, like Nestor Almendros was working with Terrence Malick in Days of Heaven. The cinematographer's role wasn't so much to express his own aesthetic. The cinematographer's role was to serve the movie, to serve the greater aspirations of the film. My goal, and the other 4 photographers who were fortunate to work on this project, we were there to essentially serve Mary's vision, the goals of the project, and it's a more collaborative as opposed to the more individual approach that maybe any one of the 5 of us would have taken if we were working independently.
Can I add to that?
Please.
Sorry, George. One of the things, if you look at George's picture of the Calgary Stampede, that matches, that was taken at the 100th year anniversary of the Stampede. It took me 7 years to find a movie by Bud Butcher that I had heard had been shot at the Stampede, but I couldn't confirm it. And it's about rodeo Western cowboys, and George is shot at the Calgary Stampede. You have to see it. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. There it is. Bud Butcher shot a movie about rodeo westerns of the atomic age, and these cowboys toured North America with little pink convertibles, and they were trailing horses behind, and they knew all the waitresses in the overnight diners, and they were just too cool for words. But one thing he explores in the movie, Bud Butcher is renowned cycle. He's a super cult director now, but very, very, very well thought of. The one thing he explores in the movie is their egos and the effect of fame on them. And George shot that picture in 2012, I think.
Yes.
And I didn't get the movie until probably 2018. But if you look at the picture, it's just a phenomenal representation of those rodeo cowboys and how Butcher portrayed them. So it's just, I mean, it's all been very magical. I don't know how we did it, but it's Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, no, I think I appreciate that, Mary. And it's also interesting. I think that photograph, I mean, on some level, it's an exceptionally unusual photograph, right? I mean, there's a lot of space. I mean, there's a small little bit of activity, but it's kind of playing that small bit of activity off against the context of the of the folks in the grandstand at the Stampede, basically, right?
Yeah. So the burning question that I have, which you touched on it with, that you have a documentary in progress, but what about a follow-up book? I mean, this only goes to 1960. We know that there's a lot more rich history after that. What are the challenges and what are some of the opportunities that come with potentially making a follow-up book to this?
You know, it's underway. I have a lot of support for it, and as I said, we're you know, I'm not the royal we. I'm looking at starting photography very soon. It's going to be a monster. You've got movies like Brokeback Mountain, Superman, The Revenant, Legends of the Fall, Little Big Man. Well, some of them are, you know, pretty evident, but how do you pick scenes from so many iconic films?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the assassination of Jesse James. Everybody I talk to expects to see the field Brad Pitt was standing in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's choosing those filming locations. It's really interesting for Brokeback Mountain, almost on the same road that George and I shot the 1926 film. There was an old farmhouse where Heath Ledger goes to see Jake Gyllenhaal's family after his death, and it was shot there. And I have spent probably 10 nights, 10 early evenings. I mean, Alberta summer evenings, you know, it's okay, it's good, but driving around, and either that house is gone or I don't have the correct coordinates. And I have a lot of people that'll help me, but because many of the movies after 1960 were shot in small towns, they got booted. They were asked. They didn't allow filmmaking in the parks after 1960. So filmmakers found other locations, but so many of those locations have completely changed. Unlike the very, very early landscapes in the parks, I guess they were preserved. But Superman, George and I got some really good shots of the house. We had a really fun morning roaming around. I love this shot of the dad's funeral at Bainan, but Bainan looks totally different. I suspect, you know, the Brokeback Mountain house is probably not there anymore. I don't know. So you're dealing with urban or buildings that may not exist. So and it's a massive history again. That's why it's, you know, so it's. I'm
Such a big project, yeah.
I'm not getting overwhelmed.
Well, we don't want Mary to get overwhelmed.
Well, there's a Bollywood history here too. Bollywood shoots. What did they say? 2 movies a month?
Yeah,
2 movies a week.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see if maybe there's a few more questions that pop up. But before we get into any of those final words, I just want to mention that at the Camera Store, we've brought this book in. So we do have copies available for purchase. And I just popped the link in the chat. And so you can check that out and see if you might want a copy. At the end, I think I'm going to get both Mary and George to sign a few copies. So if you're interested in a signed one, just place your order on the Camera Store website, and you can pop in the comments that you'd like a signed copy, and we'll be sure to ship some of those out. Georgia, do you have any questions for Mary at all?
Are you out of your mind? No, let me just, because there's an interesting quote, and this really, it's not so much a question, but it's a little homage, I guess. The famous French film director Francois Truffaut he was once asked, I mean, what's it like, you know, actually making a film? You got the crew, you got the actors, you got all this stuff going on, right? And Truffaut said, well, you know, it's a little bit like taking a stagecoach ride. You know, you start out, you're full of optimism, energy, enthusiasm. There's these beautiful people, these talented crews that you're working with. So you start out with a lot of enthusiasm, and pretty soon you're just hoping the ride's going to end, essentially, right? And I think it is really noteworthy to mention that Mary spent 12 years.
Yeah.
She went through a number of different collaborators, a number of different publishers, a number of setbacks. The 2013 flood, her husband had some health issues. So she really, it's an extraordinary act of will and strength and courage, and leavened with a good dose of craziness and stubbornness and all of those things. And I think this particular book, I don't think anybody else could have done it. Sometimes there's projects that other people can do. I think that she brought a particular level of commitment, tenacity, belief to it that is extraordinary, and we're the richer for it. There's the documentaries that are going to be coming. I think that this book will serve as kind of a foundational document for other books, historic research, perhaps novels. It's going to be a very fertile publication for many other significant works of film and literature and research and history to come from. So I think we Canadians owe this woman a debt of thanks.
I couldn't have made this book without the photographers. We didn't really know what the assignment was, and every picture turned out perfectly appropriate. We found locations. we were also filming at the time of year, and that was very important to the setting. We also had to sort of look back. Some of Alberta is represented as the Swiss Alps, or look at the actual. So the photographers were phenomenal. I'm absolutely terrified because there are a lot of movies after 1960 shot in Drumheller, and GW is from Drumheller.
I want the Drumheller sheet, Mary.
He's got it. And also Days of Heaven. Like, how do I pick I'm obviously going to have to let him pick what he shoots for that. I hadn't before, but I can't deny him. So.
Thanks, Brian.
How do you pick a scene from Days of Heaven?
Yeah,
it's going to be
really extraordinary.
Yeah.
Well, we just can't wait to see what comes of that. So, of course, I again want to thank the TCSTV Live Dream Team for making all this happen tonight, and for both of you for coming into the camera store,
Thanks,
into their book nook, to share this new title. It's absolutely stunning. We've only shown you guys just the tip of the iceberg as far as what is inside of this book. So if you want to pop over, come to the camera store if you're local. If you're not, definitely check it out. Is there some other places where people can find this book besides the camera store if they're outside of Canada?
Booktopia in Australia, Watertones or Waterstones in New Zealand. It has been on Global Art Books in the UK, but it keeps selling out. I'm not sure what that is. Rio Christie is another UK website that I think might be connected to Global Art Books. I'm not sure, because they had 50 copies that I don't know who's buying them, but thank you. Amazon.com, there's a couple of bookstores. I think there's something wrong with the supply chain to the States, because it was picked up by a couple of U.S. distributors and it was in a couple of stores, and that's kind of gone quiet. So I think there's an issue with the supply chain to the States, so hopefully that'll get fixed.
Yeah.
Germany, France, it's huge in South America. Brazil, there's Amazon India, the South American distributor. You wouldn't know if you're there, but they have it too.
Phenomenal. And then, of course, if you are in Canada, go to thecamerastore.com and find it. We'd love to ship you a copy across the country. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We love doing these TCSTV live streams with the Dream Team. So make sure you comment below. If you enjoyed what you saw, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and head over to thecamerastore.com to see what events we have coming up next. Until next time, thank you very much.